Hey everybody out there, Timothy here with Mana Rocks, and this is part 2 of our War of the Spark limited set review, this time looking at all of the white cards. If you watched the first episode, you know that I already covered every single Planeswalker in the set, so these videos will not have the Planeswalkers in them, although you can go back and look at that video for reference on the most powerful Planeswalkers in white. Gideon was basically the standout walker, but we also had some kind of build around weaker walkers like Teo and the Wanderer. Anyway, check that video out if you're interested in the mono white planeswalkers or all of the planeswalkers in general. This time we're going to be covering the rest of the cards in white, all of the commons, uncommons, rares, and mythics in the color, and we are going to be going by our usual kind of scale or kind of grading system where I tell you what point in the pack I'm interested in picking them up. If they're a complete bomb rare, then they're my first pick. If they're a little bit less than that, then I have a high pick category, and then all the way down to the low pick category. But we're going to go through every single card, working our way up to the best of the best here. And yeah, it's going to be difficult. This is probably one of the hardest sets I've ever even considered reviewing, just on account of the Planeswalkers and how that warps the format. But enough about that. Make sure you subscribe below. Find us on Twitter at MTG_ManaRocks, and let's go ahead and get into the card. First category are the sideboard and build around cards. These are cards that I don't typically put in my deck. They often include some really kind of niche rares or niche cards that require other cards to be good, but when you do build around them, they have an effect that they otherwise wouldn't. They tend to be pretty low picks though, unless you know, there's some sort of standout build around that gets really, really good. I'm thinking a card like High Alert or something along those lines, but let's see what we've got here. Our first card is Ignite the Beacon. 4 and a white for a rare instant. It says search your library for up to 2 planeswalkers, reveal them, put them to your hand, and shuffle your library. I don't know. I don't know how many planeswalkers you should actually expect to have in your pool. If you think about it, there's a walker in every single pack. There's 8-person pod. That's 24 walkers, and on average, you should expect to have about 3 of them in your pool. So if you have just the average 3, and assuming they're all playable, I don't think Ignite the Beacon really does what you want. If you're playing some kind of weird 5-6 planeswalker deck, if that tends to pan out and your planeswalkers are actually decent, or they have kind of silver bullet effects against what your opponent's doing, maybe you have like a Narset and your opponent's just drawing a bunch of cards, then sure, Ignite the Beacon could be playable, but I think I want 4+ planeswalkers in my deck before I even consider playing Ignite the Beacon, and this is just not a format where you can afford to not affect the board. Some planeswalkers can carry the game. They can take the game away from you if you let them tick up too much. I mentioned this in the previous video that there aren't too many planeswalkers that actually do that, but there are a few, so you have to constantly be affecting the board in order to A, protect your planeswalkers, or B, pressure your opponent's planeswalkers. And a 5-mana instant that, yes, gets you 2 specific cards, but requires basically a whole turn of setup to do that, I'm just not seeing it here. Rally of Wings is next. This is 1 and a white for an uncommon instant. You untap all creatures you control, and then creatures you control with flying get +2/+2 until end of turn. If you have a bunch of fire, this is an extremely powerful effect for just 2 mana, but 2 mana to just untap your creatures is an extremely underwhelming effect. So you need to have a bunch of flyers to make this card worth it, and if you do, this card's very good, but it's something that I'm not looking to pick up early. If I draft in my deck, and it turns out I actually do just happen to have a bunch of flyers, then Rally of Wings gets a lot better, and I'll pick it up there. This, on power level, would probably fit in like the medium power level category, but if you're just using this to untap a bunch of creatures, it's quite bad. So you got to find a middle ground of having a bunch of flyers, and if you have a bunch of flyers already, they usually don't need that much extra work to be good. They're already going to be good enough, since evasion is key in this set. So I don't know where I stand on Rally of Wings. It's the type of card you don't want to forget about because it does have an extremely powerful effect when it works, but your deck needs to support it before you even include it in the first place. Ravnica at War is next, another rare. This one is 3 and a white for a rare sorcery that exiles all multicolored permanents. Well, I mean, it's not too complicated to see why this is a sideboard card. I don't think this is a format where multicolored permanents are just going to completely dominate the game. Yes, there are a lot of multicolored planeswalkers, but you're bound to have a lot of those yourself, and unless you're drafting like a mono white or, I don't know, green white with just monocolored permanents, this has the same kind of effect on your permanents that it does on the opponent. So it's not a reliable board wipe, it's more of a conditional board wipe against certain types of cards, and it might not even put you in a strong position. This is the type of rare you'll be, I think, disappointed to open, and if you really want one, maybe you're just not drafting a bunch of monocolored permanents yourself, then you can probably pick it up a little bit later in the draft. But yeah, I don't think this card's super powerful, and I don't think it's something you want to be first picking either. We have Charmed Stray. I actually like these sorts of effects. They've been putting one or two of them in every single set recently, and I think it leads to some fun decks when the format goes on. But anyway, Charmed Stray is our 1 white for a 1/1 lifelinker. That's pretty bad. People do love their 1-mana 1/1s. They feel like it's really aggro when it gets in some damage, but that by itself is a very, very bad card. However, it does say when Charmed Stray enters the battlefield, you put a 1/1 counter on each other creature you control named Charmed Stray. So it's one of those like Persistent Petitioner or Goblin Gathering type cards. Now, what I learned from kind of forcing the Goblin Gathering deck for like basically the last month is that a particular common really only comes up like maybe 3 or 4 times in an 8-man pod. You're not going to have like the 6 or 7 Charmed Stray deck unless something really weird happens or you get very lucky. The other side of that is that a lot of other people won't be interested in this card, so you can probably pick up the ones that are at the table. Nonetheless, I don't think this card is worth going into, but it is a build around nonetheless. It's virtually unplayable on its own. If you have 2 copies, it's still not good unless you are 100% certain you're always going to go turn 1 Charmed Stray, turn 2 Charmed Stray. But once you have like 4 copies, I think this card actually gets pretty strong because you can reliably go turn 1 Stray, turn 2 Stray, and that's all right. Other than that, I don't think you should be drafting this card. Again, I think it's cool to have these sorts of cards. It's always fun to mess around with them. But, you know, I learned with Goblin Gathering and I learned with Persistent Petitioners, those sorts of strategies just don't pan out very well. And even when they are doing their thing, if they get disrupted, it's still not that strong. All right, moving into our filler category. These are cards that I'm looking to pick up towards the end of a pack or I'm looking to wheel them. I'm not super interested in putting them in the deck, but they'll still make the deck anyway. Some of these I'm hoping never make the deck, but for the most part, the card quality is pretty high in this set, so even the filler cards are decent. Go ahead and start off with Bulwark Giant. This is 5 and a white for a 3/6 common. It's a giant soldier, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain 5 life. There's a decent amount of life gain just tacked onto cards in this set, as we'll see. But, you know, that's not going to be super relevant if your opponent is just card advantaging you out, right? And 6 mana is a lot for a 3/6. Think about this as like basically the same as Watchful Giant. That was the 3/6 that made a 1/1 when it entered the battlefield. I don't think that card was ever good, and I don't think anyone ever cast it against me, which means people knew it wasn't good. I just don't think Bulwark Giant is going to be good either, even though it's a card that if you just really need some late game card to put in your white deck, you can play it. Clearly, it's geared towards defense more than it is offense, and it can be annoying if this gets stuck against a super aggro deck since the 5 life gets you kind of stabilized and the big toughness means that it's probably not going to die. There's a lot of good removal. This isn't invulnerable. It's just kind of a card you can put in your deck, but you should probably look for better. Defiant Strike is back. Seemed like kind of a weird reprint, but I think it's here because of Feather, the legendary Boros Angel, which we'll talk about in a later video. But anyway, Defiant Strike is a single white mana for a common instant. Target creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn. Draw a card. It's a pretty basic effect. It's a little annoying when someone uses it against you, but it's not a really profound effect, and it does cantrip. It cycles for a single mana as long as there's any creature in play, so I guess that's fine, but it doesn't really do anything, right? An extra point of damage isn't that much. It doesn't give any combat abilities. It doesn't pump toughness, so it's not really a good combat trick. It's basically there to just cycle. And that's what it did last time, too. This was printed in a set that had prowess, and it was okay there, but never exceptional. I think you really only play this if you have feather in your deck, and even then there are probably better combat tricks you can use. Loxodon Sergeant is back. Not back, but here. 3 and a white for a 3/3 common elephant soldier with vigilance, and when it enters the battlefield, other creatures you control gain vigilance until end of turn. I mentioned in the Planeswalker video that vigilance is an underrated ability, but it's still not like anything exceptional. We just got out of a set where we were playing this same exact card, except it gave your team +1/+1 instead of vigilance, and that +1/+1 is much better than just giving all your guys vigilance. If your creatures already weren't in a position to attack, vigilance doesn't really make them that much better at attacking. It just means that you might be able to attack and still have some blocks if you're racing with your opponent, and I guess that's fine, but it's not exceptional, and Loxodon Sergeant by himself is just a glorified hill giant with vigilance. I don't know, it's not great. You can include it in your deck, and if you're looking to beat down, then this card's fine, but it's replaceable. Teo's Light Shield is up, 2 and a white for a 0/3, sold for a common illusion. When it enters the battlefield, put a 1/1 counter on target creature you control. You'll see this effect come up a lot in this set, and that's because Proliferate is in every single color, which we'll talk about Proliferate with 1 or 2 cards in this video, but it's not super dominant in white. But anyway, if you have a bunch of Proliferate, you can play a Teo's Light Shield, but the card's pretty bad otherwise. It's also worth noting that everyone I talk to seems to think this card has Defender, but it doesn't, on account of Teo making defending walls. Yeah, the Light Shield doesn't have Defender, and it can always target itself to be a 1/4, but if you're not proliferating this counter, this is pretty bad rate unless you're getting a really good attack in. There are a couple good bears in the set, 2-mana 2/2s that can pick up a counter and attack through your opponent's 2/2, and I think that's fine, but I would rather have a more aggressive card than a 0/3 doing that than to play a 0/3 just to get an additional point of power on board. Populist Statue is next, 2 and a white, common, instant, tap target permanent. If it's an artifact, destroy it, draw a card. Not really that many artifacts you have to worry about in this set. I guess this is technically main deckable artifact destruction, but there aren't really even that many artifacts that when your opponent plays them, you have to really go out of your way to destroy it. A lot of times, if this is included in your deck, you're just cycling it and stopping your opponent from attacking for a turn. Pressure Point, if you've ever played that card. This is essentially the same thing with some artifact destruction tacked on, but I don't think this is going to be a prevalent card or one that you really need to go out of your way to draft. It's not even really that much of a sideboard card, because if you do see an artifact, it's not very likely you need to board in to destroy it. Again, there just aren't that many artifacts that are even that threatening in this set, so if you're playing this, you're looking to cycle and stave off some damage. And if you're not looking to do that, you probably shouldn't be playing this. Rising Populist is next, 2 and a white for a 2/2 common human. Whenever another creature or planeswalker you control dies, put a +1/+1 counter on Rising Populist. So this is kind of a buffed up unruly mob, basically just getting bigger as creatures die. It only counts when one of your things dies. But it also counts when a planeswalker dies, and a lot of times the planeswalkers, your opponent will have to deal with them. So once a single thing has died, this becomes a 3-mana 3/3. I don't know if this is one of those cards that's going to come back and overperform, and it's just going to end up being a 4/4 or 5/5 some amount of the time, because the planeswalker kind of theme of this set does mean there's going to be a lot of combat going on, and a lot of combat means a lot of creatures dying, which means the populace can get bigger. The reason I have this in such a low category is because if you play it out, and maybe it's your first play of the game, then it's just a 3-mana 2/2. If there are no other creatures dying, your opponent's just kind of beating you down in the air. It's a little bit embarrassing of a card. 3-mana 2/2 does not cut it, and I want my cards to do a little bit more than that, but I recognize that there will be some matchups where the Rising Populist could end up being the biggest threat on board. Sunblade Angel, I want to like this card a lot more, but we'll talk about why I don't like it. It's 5 and a white for a 3/3, sold, uncommon. It's an angel, and it has flying, First Strike, Vigilance, and Lifelink. That is a lot of abilities. First off, the combination of Vigilance and First Strike just means that this thing can attack and block very well. And then Lifelink means that you can't really race it until you deal with it. But that's the problem. It's very, very easy to deal with. We'll talk about this throughout basically every single video in the colors. The next 5 or 6 videos. The removal in this set is very good. And I mean like way above average than what we are used to in limited sets. And that makes a 6 mana 3/3 way worse. If you pay 6 mana for this and your opponent answers it with a card that only costs 2 or 3 mana, 2 or 3 mana, then that's a complete blowout. And if the Sunblade Angel goes unchecked, it's pretty good, right? Evasion's nice, Lifelink's good in a race, Vigilance means you can keep attacking and blocking. Yeah, it's fine, right? But your opponent's going to be able to answer it some amount of the time, and actually most amount of the time, I think, and I just don't think this card is going to cut it when you play it. It's nice when it goes unchecked, but I think it'll be checked quite often. Gideon's Sacrifice, maybe the most unplayable white card in the set. I'm not quite seeing a case where I want to play this in my main deck yet, but we'll see. It's a single white mana, it's a common, it's an instant, and it says you choose a creature or planeswalker you control, and all damage that would be dealt to you this turn or to your other permanents is dealt to the permanent that you chose. Note that it doesn't actually target the permanent that you chose, so your opponent can't get rid of that with a kill spell and then you just take normal damage. But the permanent still has to be on the board. It even says that in the reminder text if it's still on the battlefield. I don't know. This basically lets you redirect a bunch of damage to some permanent you control instead of whatever was happening. There are times where this is really good. Your opponent's attacking you with 3 creatures, you block with a bunch, and all the damage that's dealt to your permanents is dealt to, like, I don't know, some planeswalker that can't even activate anymore because it's on 1 loyalty. But those situations don't come up as often as people seem to think they do. When it happens, it's great, right? And it's nice to have this, but there are a lot of games where this will just sit in your hand, and it's hard to engineer a situation where it's good. I guess you can use it as like the world's worst fog, but it doesn't really leave behind anything once that's done, and something's probably dying, right? If you just have a bunch of creatures on board and you make it so that all the damage is dealt to one of your creatures, you're still losing something, and you cast an instant to do it. So unless you can put yourself in a position to kind of kill off some of your opponent's creatures mid-combat or something like that, then I don't think Gideon's Sacrifice is going to be a card that should be making your main deck. Average, medium picks, these are our next cards on the list. These are the ones that usually don't wheel, but I'm not looking to pick them up. If I find out that I'm already drafting white, then I'm a little bit happier to pick these up, but they're not really reasons to go into white. Starting off, we have Gideons Triumph. There's a cycle of triumphs here that all have a basic effect, and if you control the planeswalker featured in the name, then you get to double the effect, or you get to add something to the effect. In the case of Gideon's Triumph, it's 1 and a white, instant, it's an uncommon. I believe they are all uncommons, and it says target opponent sacrifices a creature that attacked or blocked this turn. If you control a Gideon Planeswalker, that player sacrifices 2 of those creatures instead. I'm going to rule out that last text. I guess if you first pick Gideon, congratulations, and then maybe you pick this up a little bit higher. But I'm just going to act as though you don't have the Planeswalker that goes with these cards when I'm evaluating them. So it's essentially 2 mana to make your opponent sacrifice an attacker or a blocker. And the way it's worded, those creatures no longer have to be attacking or blocking as long as they declared an attack or block that turn. So you can use this during the second main phase or the end phase to kill off a creature that's still alive, even if it went through combat. This is a fine effect that's usually pretty bad against go-wide decks because your opponent can kind of pick and choose which one of their creatures is the worst to get rid of, and then you're still left dealing with all the big creatures. So I don't normally think these cards are amazing, but I do think there's some value there in just being able to pick off a creature, especially if your opponent's in a position where maybe they're only attacking with a single creature, and that's like their big beater or something like that. Then Gideon's Triumph's going to be just fine. It's kind of the definition of an average removal spell. It's going to be good when it's good, but there are times where it's going to be quite bad, and I think that justifies its spot on this list. Ajani's Pridemate is back with new art finally. It's 1 in a white. We've seen this card from M19. You should know this card. 1 in a white for a 2/2 uncommon cat soldier. Whenever you gain life, put a +1/+1 counter on Ajani's Pridemate. This is eroded now, so that it's no longer a May ability, so take that, haha. Yeah, there's some incidental life gain going on in here, plus there's a decent number of life linkers in the set, so I expect Ajani's Pridemate to be about as good as it ever is. I think it was probably at its best in M19 because there were some recurable or repeatable sources of life gain, which there aren't really a lot of here, outside of maybe 1 or 2 planeswalkers like Ajani himself. So if you have, excess life gain or kind of situational side life gain on some of your cards, then Pridemate gets a little bit better. The reason this is in the middle category, and we'll see this with a couple other cards coming up, is that it's a 2-mana 2/2. And I just think this format is going to be one where 2 power creatures for 2 mana are going to be decent, either to block your opponent's 2/2 or just get some pressure on board and make sure that you don't fall behind some big planeswalker that your opponent plays. And I think that'll be a line of play. You just want to make sure you're curving out and getting creatures on board before your opponent can stick some planeswalker. And if you fail to get creatures on board, you just fall behind in some cases. So 2-mana 2/2 with some minor upside. We'll see a couple of these in this same category, but Ajani's Pridemate still gets the single thumbs up for me, and I would guess it's probably about the same as it's ever been. Makeshift Battalion, great name. It's, basically a battalion creature. It's a 2 and a white for a 3/2 common human soldier. Whenever the Makeshift Battalion and at least 2 other creatures attack, put a +1/+1 counter on it. Yeah, fine card. 3-mana 3/2 is a stat line that I really don't like, especially considering that I just said I like 2-mana 2/2s, and they trade up favorably with 3-mana X2s, but the Battalion has a little bit of extra upside. It does incentivize you to be playing a pretty aggressive strategy that can get out creatures early on, and it plays decently with Proliferate as well, if you can get that additional counter, or pump spells, things of that nature. So it's an aggressive card. I could take it or leave it. I don't think it's much better or much worse than the 2/2s with upside that we're going to see here, but there are some games where it could get carried away, and I think it's just fine. Bond of Discipline is next. This one is 4 and a white. The disciplines or bonds of whatever they're called, this is another cycle, but it's really just a flavor cycle. Each bond has 2 abilities, one from 2 different guilds that are kind of combined together to make one big spell. But that's really just flavor stuff. We'll evaluate them all separately. It's not like a actual cycle where the mechanic is tied together. In this case, Bond of Discipline is 4 and a white. It's uncommon. It's a sorcery. It says tap all creatures your opponents control. Creatures you control gain a lifelink until end of turn. That could be a huge swingy effect. In fact, this is the type of card that when you cast it, you could just win the game the turn you cast it. You have a bunch of creatures on board. Your opponent no longer has blockers. You attack with everything and they're dead. And all of your creatures have lifelink. So even if they're not dead, you're probably way ahead in the race. But you kind of have to respect the fact that there are games where maybe you don't have any creatures on board, and this card does literally nothing. It's a sorcery, so tapping all of your opponent's creatures at sorcery speed just doesn't do anything, and it could be quite bad. So kind of have to temper your evaluation of cards like this. Yes, when you cast this card, a lot of times you will win the game the turn you cast it, but there are also times where it's just going to sit in your hand and you can't cast it at all because it doesn't do anything. Martyr for the Cause, another bear with upside here. This one is 1 and a white. It's a 2/2. It's a common human soldier. When it dies, proliferate. If you don't have anything with counters on board, this is just a 2-mana 2/2, and that's, respectable. If my hunch is correct and 2-mana 2/2s really are kind of the backbone of how you deal with a Planeswalker heavy set, then this card will be fine even if it doesn't proliferate anything. But it's the type of card that's nice to just play out early and then maybe stick a Planeswalker, and then you have the option to proliferate that Planeswalker. It also works quite nicely with the other creatures like Makeshift Battalion. The unruly mob type creature we saw that gets a counter whenever a creature dies is pretty nice with this, and I think it'll be just a nice little smooth creature to play on turn 2. Basically on par with something like a Johnny's Pridemate. It doesn't have the ability to just kind of carry away a game like a Johnny's Pridemate sometimes does, but I think it'll be fine. Similarly, we have another 2-mana creature here, Pouncing Lynx. This one is 1 and a white. It's a 2/1 common, a little bit worse. 2/1 is not as good as 2/2, clearly. And as long as it's your turn, it has first strike. So it's a good attacker, it's a bad blocker. I don't know that that makes it much better or much worse than, say, Martyr for the Cause or Johnny's Pridemate, but if you want to play your 2-power creature, you want to start attacking, then that's fine. It's also a decent creature to receive +1/+1 counters from other effects, maybe your Teo's Light Shield or what have you, because a first striker gets a lot better when it has more power. It can be picked off by a couple things in this format that do deal 1 damage, so it is punishable, but I think it'll do the trick just fine, and I don't know, it falls into the same category as all of the other 2-mana, 2-power white creatures that we've seen. War Screecher is next, 1 and a white for a 1/3 common burb. It has flying, as most burbs do, and for 5 and a white, you can tap it, and your other creatures you control gain +1/+1 until end of turn. I glossed over that, but 5 and a white, that is a lot to Anthem your board, but it's upside. The reason this gets kind of the middle category pick, where something like a Pegasus Courser would normally get kind of the low category pick, is because I just went through 3 or 4 cards saying that I think 2-power creatures for 2 mana are going to be decent, and this thing blocks those. Plus, evasion is nice at pressuring your opponent's creatures. I don't think that activated ability is going to be anything, you know, to write home about. I don't think it's going to steal too many games, or it's going to be something that you really have to worry about. But it's there, and you can activate it late in the game to make your creatures a little bit better. It's a little awkward to have a tap ability that costs 6 mana on your little 2-mana 1-power flyer, but upside is upside, and I think this will be a decent blocker until it becomes a relevant attacker later in the game. Battlefield Promotion is next. Maybe this ends up being pretty poor, but I think it's fine. It's 1 and a white. It is a common instant. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. That creature gains first strike until end of turn. You gain 2 life. I'm going to evaluate this basically the same as if it didn't say you gain 2 life, but that's a nice little bonus. Also love the art of her just kind of like smiling, getting promoted, and the buildings are just burning down in the background, but whatever. Put a +1/+1 counter on first strike until end of turn for 2 mana. I think that's fine. If you can put this down on a creature, make it win a combat, and then it gets to keep that +1 counter, that's a pretty good combat trick. And then, you know, if you have anything that proliferates, that's going to be quite fine as well. So if you're looking to play aggressively, this card gets pretty nice, kind of similarly to Sure Strike, where it lets you attack pretty freely. And if your opponent's tapped out or they, you know, have just even blocks, this lets you trade your pump spell for their blocker. You gain a little bit of life, whatever, but your creature becomes bigger in the process, and it stays that way. And I think that's fine. A little bit worse on defense, I think, just because there's more potential to get blown out when you're holding up combat tricks on defense, but still an option there. First strike's a nice ability to get attached to a power bump on a combat trick. Divine Arrow is here, and this is what, Gideon's Reprisal, basically, just a different card name. It's 1 and a white, it's a common, it's an instant, and it says Divine Arrow deals 4 damage to target attacking or blocking creature. Yeah, I believe this is just Gideon's Reprisal, right, with just a different flavor on it. Always a fine card. White doesn't get too many just straight removal spells anymore. You know, we're going to see 1 or 2 of those later on, but your combat-based removal spells is kind of what you would expect here. And as far as common removal goes, I think Divine Arrow is just fine. It is a little bit awkward that there are going to be some decks, I think mainly like the blue-red deck, the spells-based decks that just don't care too much about attacking or care about whether their creatures die. And this gets a little bit worse against them, but it's always going to be fine, and 4 damage is enough to basically guarantee that you kill most things. Plus, you can trade up mana on this card pretty easily. It's going to be able to kill a lot of 4 or 5 mana creatures, and that's just efficient. It's not something you want 4 or 5 copies of, but you'll play 1 or 2 in most of your white decks. Enforcer Griffin. Speaking of creatures that die to Divine Arrow, here we have Enforcer Griffin, 4 and a white. It's a 3/4 flyer. It's a common Griffin and has some very undeserved flavor text, but I found this stat line to be fine in the past. I can't remember just a vanilla 3/4 flyer other than like Sky Swirl Harrier from Kaladesh, but that card was fine. And I think this card's going to be fine here too. It does dodge a lot of the 3 damage removal spells as well that are floating around this format, which is quite nice. And evasion is just a fine thing to have attached to 3 power. So I think this is your kind of bread and butter vanilla flyer, and I don't think you can ask for too much more on it. And I think last card for this category is Ironclad Crow. Okay, it's 3 and a white for a vanilla 2/5. It's a common beast. Normally, I would rate this card a little bit lower, but I don't know. It does block all those 2/2s that I'm claiming are going to be good in this format, and I kind of have to give a shout out to my boy Wishcoin Crab, which was a card I never thought would be as good as it was. But Wishcoin Crab really held down the fort, and this is basically the same exact card, just shifted to white instead of blue. So I don't think this is an insane card. You don't want a bunch of these, but you'll probably end up playing this more than you think you will. Now we get to talk about some really exciting cards. The above average cards, these are the cards I'm looking to pick up early in the draft. They never wheel. Maybe they're not slam dunk first pick bombs, but if I get past one in the first 2 to 3 picks of the draft, I'm quite happy. First one up is Helion 2. This clearly reads like a bomb, but there's one glaring thing about it. It's 8 mana. 8 mana is a lot. But anyway, this is a vehicle. There are 3 vehicles in this set, I believe. 1 in white, 1 in blue, 1 in red. This one costs 6 white, 8 mana for a rare vehicle. Its crew cost is crew 4. So again, if you haven't played with vehicles, I don't think we had any in the rest of the Ravnica sets. So if you're a little bit newer, crew 4 means that in order to turn this into a creature, you have to tap any number of creatures you control with power equal to the crew cost. In this case, you have to tap a bunch of creatures with total power 4 or more, and that'll turn Helion 2 into a creature for the turn, and then it becomes a house. It's a 5/5, it has flying, first strike, and vigilance, so it's attacking, it's not getting blocked, and you still have it back on defense if you have any more untapped creatures, which you will, because whenever Helion 2 attacks, you create 2 4/4 white angel creature tokens with flying and vigilance that are attacking. They come down attacking, they're not tapped, they are just sitting there, they're attacking, they're back for blocks. That's 8 extra power plus the 5 from the Helion, 13 power in the air. Helion 2 will kill your opponent if it comes down and it's unchecked immediately. But I have to give a nod to the 8 mana there. There are times that you'll have this card in your hand and you just never get to cast it. There are times where you play this and you actually can't even crew it, which is really sad when that happens. But crew 4 is a little bit more than it seems like. Trust me, if you've played with vehicles before, you know this already. But if you haven't played with vehicles, it is kind of sad when you play these high crew cost vehicles and you can't actually crew them. The good thing, of course, is that if you ever get one attack out of this and your opponent's not dead, those angels can continue to crew the Helion, and you should win within 1 to 2 turns of this thing attacking. It's a sweet card. I'm going to be drafting it. I'm going to look to ramp into it in maybe a green-white base deck or something like that. And I think I'm going to be first picking it quite often, but you do have to realize there is a risk in running an 8 mana card and having that as your only big game finisher. Tomik, the Distinguished Advocate, is next. He is white for a 2/3 flyer. He's a rare. He's a human advisor. He's a legendary. Lands on the battlefield and land cards in the graveyard can't be the targets of spells or abilities your opponents control, and your opponents can't play land cards from graveyards. This is a lot of text, very similar to Lavinia in Guilds of Ravnica, or rather Ravnica Allegiance, where it's a lot of text that just doesn't come up in Limited. It's there for legacy purposes and stuff like that. Maybe, a standard safety valve against like Crucible Worlds or whatever. But for Limited, this is just a good card. 2 mana, albeit a little bit restrictive on the color cost. 2 mana for a 2/3 flyer is something that you're happy to play. I don't know that you're always first picking this guy. There are some really strong removal spells or planeswalkers that I'd be happy to take over Tomic, but if this card ends up in my deck, I'm never disappointed with it, and if you can play it on turn 2, it's going to be able to pressure your opponent or their planeswalkers, and it's got a lot of stats for just 2 mana. So this is a very efficient creature, nothing super busted, but efficiency does put it pretty high on the list here. Grateful Apparition is next up. 1 and a white for a 1/1 uncommon spirit with flying, and whenever it deals damage to a player or planeswalker, proliferate. So Thrumming Bird in white, if you've ever played with Thrumming Bird. This is essentially the same exact card with a little bit of extra upside in that you get to proliferate even if it hits your opponent's planeswalker. And I think a 2-power flyer is already, or not 2-power, but 2 mana flyer is already something that you might be interested in this set, even if it doesn't have a lot of power. Being able to proliferate all those +1/+1 counters. We saw 3, 4, maybe 5 cards in this video already that put 1/1 counters on creatures. This is a good way to get it carried away. The reason I say this is an above average or really high pick is because there is a lot of potential in a card like this to just completely win the game on its own. If you get a single counter on it and you get to hit, put another counter, hit, put another counter, hit, put another counter, and your opponent's just playing maybe a removal light deck, this card can just be a plan in a can. It can win the game. You have to get counters on things first, but there's quite a few ways to do that, and I think this card could carry you to victory basically on its own, even though a lot of times you should also respect that it's a 2-mana 1/1, and if you don't have counters, it doesn't hit very hard. Single Combat is next. A little bit waffly on this card, but I think it's going to be good. Single Combat is 3 white for a rare sorcery. 5 mana total for a sorcery. Each player chooses a creature or planeswalker they control, sacrifice the rest, and players can't cast creature or planeswalker spells until your next turn. I like this card quite a bit. Now, if it didn't have that last line of text and it was just each player sacks down to their best creature or planeswalker, there are going to be times where that's not great, and there are going to be times where it's fantastic. If your opponent just has kind of a bunch of equal power creatures on board, then you get to decimate the rest of them, and if you have something really strong that might be able to deal with that last creature, then you are going to be favored from that position. And then Single Combat also does something that we don't normally get out of our board wraths. Normally, the problem with board wraths in Limited is that you pay a bunch of mana, you wipe the board, and then your opponent gets to untap, and they're the first person who gets a crack at rebuilding, where you have to now respond to everything they're doing. Single Combat makes it so that they, you and them, it affects you too, but neither player can put additional creatures or planeswalkers on the board during that next turn cycle. So you get to keep your best creature, and then your opponent can't play something on their turn that answers it. They're going to have to wait a full turn cycle, which means you're the person who gets the first crack at rebuilding. Especially if you have perhaps the best permanent on board, the best creature or planeswalker on board after this resolves, you should be able to carry the game away in your favor. It also just gives you something that I like to have in my decks. It gives you a potential reset button. It doesn't completely deal with everything, but I like having board wipes in my deck because they get you out of situations that no other card could. If your opponent just has 3 or 4, maybe 5 creatures on board and they're just beating you down, then a card like Single Combat can save you, whereas a single target removal spell is only going to deal with 1 threat and you're going to lose to the rest. So I do think this is a card you're first picking quite often. Do recognize that there are times where your opponent's last surviving creature or planeswalker is the thing that you actually really need to deal with. So it's a little bit finicky, but I think it's pretty good. Wanderer Strike, ooh, a common. The tie-up is nice. 4 and a white for a common sorcery. Exile target creature, then proliferate. This is pretty good in my opinion. Again, the creature removal in this set is very, very good in general. There's just a ton of great removal in every single color, and Wanderer Strike, even though it's expensive, even though it's sorcery, it deals with anything. Well, any creature. Plus you get a little bit of an added bonus in being able to proliferate. Proliferate's come up on a couple cards now. We saw Grateful Apparition. We saw the Martyr for the Cause. It gets a lot better when you have a Planeswalker that minuses and then just sits there on board. You notice the template for a lot of the Planeswalkers was start at 5 loyalty, -2, -2, and then it just sits there. If you can proliferate that Planeswalker a single time, you get an additional activation out of them. and cards like Wanderer's Strike get you closer to that. So I think you're playing maybe 2 to 3 copies of this card, especially if you're looking to be a little bit grindier of a deck, and yeah, you'll take this card pretty highly. I wouldn't expect it to wheel, and I do kind of take it as a sign that white is going to be open if you see it. Law Rune Enforcer is up next. 1 white mana for a 1/2 common human soldier. For 1 mana, you can tap it, and you tap target creature with converted mana cost 2 or greater. I think the design of this card is awesome, actually. It doesn't seem like it, but I think there's a lot of nuance into how this card was designed. First off, it's a fantastic tapper. It taps basically anything. Anything that costs 2 mana or more, tap it down. It cannot tap 1 mana creatures, which means that it cannot tap down your opponent's Law Rune Enforcer if they have one, and it can't tap 0 mana creatures, which means it can't tap tokens. So even though this is a super efficient tapper, and tappers tend to be some of the better commons that we have in sets, it doesn't deal with tokens, and tokens are the way that a lot of these planeswalkers protect themselves. So Law Rune Enforcer is good against a lot of the other creatures in the set, but pretty bad against the planeswalkers themselves. So I think you're going to take this card highly. I think you'll be very happy to play it. And if you're aggressive, this card's great. And if you're defensive, this card's great. But note that it was designed in such a way that it doesn't just let you deal with everything your opponent has. You kind of have to pick and choose where your battles are when you have this tapper, especially since it can't tap your opponent's tapper. You can't do the trick where you tap down their guy on their end step and then you untap and tap another thing. It doesn't do that if they have their own Law Rune Enforcer. And I think that's really cool. This is a high pick. If you have not played with a tapper like this, then trust me, it's really good, but it doesn't tap down everything, and I think that's a good thing, even though there are situations where that's going to be quite bad for you. Trusted Pegasus is up next. Crusty design on this card. We're seeing this quite a bit recently. It's 2 and a white for a 2/2 flyer. It is a common, which is very good. And it says, whenever Trusted Pegasus attacks, target attacking creature without flying gains flying until end of turn. It's a little bit weirdly worded. We saw this card with Rock Charger, with Pegasus Courser, but this time it's a 2/2 instead of a 1/3. And it just makes sure that another creature can get in there with flying. It grants evasion to a creature that doesn't have evasion, and it lets you just keep jamming. This card is fantastic. It was great as a 1/3. I think it's going to be great as a 2/2, and I trust that you'll be very happy playing this. Probably one of the better commons you can get for an aggressive deck, and good at pressuring your opponent's planeswalkers. I can say that with every single flyer that comes up, but it's true, right? And this one's especially great since it can get other creatures into the red zone that otherwise might not be able to attack. Prison Realm up next, another great removal spell. This one is 2 and a white. It is an uncommon enchantment. Not a lot of enchantments in this set, worth noting. When Prison Realm enters the battlefield, exile target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls until Prison Realm leaves the battlefield, and when it enters the battlefield, scry 1. Just kind of throwing scry 1 on stuff because why not, I guess. Yeah, this card's great. It's going to deal with literally any creature or planeswalker. It is worth noting that the planeswalker removal, or the removal in general, like I said, it has been pushed to a really high level in this set, but a lot of times if you're using this as an answer to a planeswalker, they've already gotten value off of it. Since your opponent gets to play their planeswalker and activate it right away, when you Prison Realm it, they've already gotten something out of the deal. So this card's maybe a tiny bit worse than you would suspect against planeswalkers, but at the very least, it's unconditional creature removal in the form of an enchantment, which is not very likely to be destroyed, at least not in game 1. And I think you are going to pick up as many Prison Realms as possible and put every single one of them into your deck. It's just a nice little catch-all answer. It doesn't deal with enchantments, doesn't deal with artifacts, but it deals with the things that really matter in this set, and that's very important. All right, and then our bombs. We've got a couple cards to talk about here. The bombs in this set, the mythic rares in this set, are nuts. We already talked about the planeswalkers, and I think all 3 of the mythic planeswalkers made it into my bomb category, my god tier pick, or whatever the heck I called it. In this case, that's true for white as well. We've got a couple bombs here, starting with Finale of Glory. So this is also a cycle. There is a finale in each color. It has an X in its mana cost. I believe they're all color X. I think that's right. And then they give you some effect based on what X is, and then if X is 10 or more, they give you some really over-the-top effect as well. I'm going to mostly ignore that, but it's kind of cool that it's there, right? If it's good without the X is 10 clause, then it's going to be really good, and then there are going to be a few games here and there where the X is 10 clause comes up, and it's just going to feel ridiculous. In this case, Finale of Glory is X white white for a mythic sorcery, and you create X 2/2 white soldier creature tokens with vigilance. That's very good. For 5 mana, you get 3 2/2s. For 4 mana, you get 2 2/2s. That's a card you typically see on commons, but this is a little bit more versatile than that. If X is 8, or if the total mana cost is 8, you get 6 guys, and just being able to kind of form a game plan around this, make a bunch of dudes, and just kind of win the game with those dudes seems really good. This is a good finisher. It plays very nice with mass board pumps. It's good at pressuring your opponent's planeswalkers. In fact, your opponent's planeswalkers are basically just dead if you resolve this against them. And then you do have the over-the-top clause here. If X is 10 or more, also create X 4/4 white angel creature tokens with flying and vigilance. So if you cast this, God forbid, X is 10, 12 mana total, then you get 10 2/2s with vigilance, and you get 10 4/4 flyers with vigilance. That game, my friends, is over, but you deserved it. You cast a 12 mana spell. I think there are going to be a few games where people want to get very, very greedy. Maybe they're at 8 mana and they're like, well, I just need to draw 4 more lands. Just don't be that guy. If this is going to be powerful enough to cast with X equal to 4 or 5 or 6, then you cast it. You don't get super greedy, and that's going to be good enough for you as well. The fact that this does have the extra clause on it is some sweet little gravy, and if it comes up, take a screenshot because it's awesome, but you don't need that to happen for this card to be good. And then perhaps the best white card in the entire set, in fact, I'm pretty confident saying it's the best white card in the entire set, is God Eternal Oketra. And you'll sense a theme here with the God Eternals. They're all quite busted. God Eternal Oketra, sporting some really sick art, is 3 white white for a mythic rare. It's a 3/6 zombie god, legendary, has double strike. So 3/6 double strike is essentially a 6/6 for 5 mana that gets really, really beefy with +1/+1 counters. And then here's the kicker. Whenever you cast a creature spell, create a 4/4 black zombie warrior creature token with vigilance. Whenever you cast a creature spell, anytime you cast a creature, you make a 4/4. Doesn't matter what you cast. You cast a 1/1, congrats, you also get a 4/4. Cast a 5/5, congrats, you get a 4/4. Oketra is going to win virtually every game she's played in, even if she's the last card in your hand and you just don't have any other creatures. She's got good stats on her own, and then every creature you top deck for the rest of that game is going to give you a free 4/4. And then we should talk about the God clause here. There are 5 gods in the set, 1 for each monocolor. Spoiler alert, they're all bombs, but they all have this same clause that say whenever it dies or it's put into exile from the battlefield, you may put it into its owner's library 3rd from the top. So that's worth talking about, because the normal way you deal with these god-type cards that have these recursive abilities is you exile them instead of killing them, but this time Wizards was like, nope, you exile it, it's going back into the library. You killed it, it's going back into the library, so you'll have to face it down 3 turns later, and it's going to be just as good then as it was the first time. Yeah, the removal in the set is fantastic, but if the creature just comes back 3 turns later, you can't reliably deal with that. You have to race it somehow. You can't just sit there forever and hope that you can remove it every time it comes down. It is worth noting that mill works decently against these. Not that there's a ton of mill cards, and I'm not saying you should play all of your mill cards main deck because people are going to have gods. But if you have something like Ashiok and your opponent plays a God Eternal Oketra and you kill it, it goes back into the library. If you can exile it or mill it off the top of the library before they draw it, that's how you deal with the card. There aren't really pacifism type effects in this set. There's maybe 1 in blue. There aren't effects that stop it from attacking or blocking. There aren't effects that take away its ability. There's literally 1 blue one that I'm thinking of, and I can't think of any others. So if this god comes down, good luck, you're in trouble. And that's true of most of the gods as well. The fact that on its own, with no additional help, it's a 3/6 double striker is already pretty strong. and then you cast a single creature, you get so much value out of it. So God Eternal Oketra, very easy bomb here, very easy first pick. You're not realistically picking any other card out of that pack over it, and you are going to be insanely happy when you resolve it on curve, and you'll probably still be pretty happy when it comes off curve as well. So that covers everything. We'll see a lot of these other cycles repeated through the next couple colors, but we'll be doing blue next. We're going in Wooburg color order, and we'll wrap up with a single video to cover all the multicolored and lands and artifacts and so on and so forth. So be tuned to the rest of the series. I'm trying to get one of these done each day, but I have to put aside the time to kind of record everything and edit it and whatnot. It takes a while. But anyway, if you're interested, make sure you subscribe below. Make sure you stay tuned to the channel for the additional videos coming up in this series, especially when we're done with the series and the set releases. We will be drafting, and be tuned for that. You can find us below by subscribing, or you can find us on Twitter at MTG_Manarocks. And that's going to do it for today, folks. Thanks for tuning in. Now, I'll see you all next time.